Welcome to Clear to Close, Austin Real Estate Law and Title.
Welcome to Clear to Close, Austin Real Estate Law and Title with Douglas Plummer, co-founder of Midtown Title in Austin, Texas. Midtown works with builders, developers, agents, and lenders on residential and commercial real estate transactions. With a strong focus on infill development and condo regimen projects, I'm Lisa Mosbey, and today we're talking about common title issues that can delay a real estate closing and what buyers, sellers, and real estate professionals should know about them. Welcome, Douglas. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's good to talk with you.
You know, Douglas, before we get into specific examples, what is the title company's job when it comes to uncovering issues that could affect a real estate transaction?
Well, one of the things that we're responsible for is clearing up any sort of title ownership issues. So what we're primarily concerned with is anything that would impede the new buyer from owning the property. And so this is something that confuses people because they think the title company is doing everything, but there are some areas that we don't play in. So for example, zoning, if it's zoned commercial or residential, we don't get into any sort of zoning issues. We also don't get into permitting. So are there open permits still on the property that never were closed properly? That's something that the buyer would have to research for themselves. We're focused with making sure that there's no liens or encumbrances on the property that will prevent the buyer from having their intended use of the property.
Sure. And then, Douglas, what are some of the title issues that you encounter most often during a closing process?
Well, the one thing that title officials never want to hear is that phrase, I see dead people. So deceased owners in title are something that take a lot of time to clean up, and they make it very complicated. Other items that cause problems are missing releases of liens, mechanics liens that might have been placed on the property by a vendor, or even IRS liens.
Missing release liens made your list. So, how does that happen? And why can it become a problem years after the underlying debt was paid off?
Well, there's a whole host of reasons why that might be the case. Sometimes the bank sent the release to the borrower themselves and said, here you go record it. And the owner didn't know that they were supposed to, so they never did it. Sometimes the bank went bankrupt and didn't issue the release, even though the loan had gotten paid off. Sometimes there's confusion about whether the servicer or the originator of the loan are responsible for recording the release, and it doesn't happen. When that happens, then you can often have this dangling debt that's showing up on the property that really had been paid off a long time ago. There are tricks for us to get around those sorts of problems. One of the things that we'll do is say, hey, we know that you did a refinance that supposedly paid off this lien. Let's go back to that old title company, see if we can get a copy of the settlement statement showing that the lien had been paid off. And then when we get that, then title companies have what's called an indemnification agreement between each other saying, hey, we can rely on that other title company. They paid off the lien. We're good to go. And if for some reason it turns out that they didn't, we can go back to them for it.
And we have to do that so that we can transfer clear title. Is that correct?
That's right, because you don't want a property that's showing somebody else's debt still associated with it, because one of the risks is if that debt were real, then that debtor could foreclose upon your property, even though you didn't have anything to do with that original bank.
And another one that you mentioned was mechanics liens. What makes mechanic liens so difficult when they surface in the middle of a transaction?
Well, mechanics liens are tricky because typically they arise when the owner of the property contracted with, say, an HVAC company to put in a new HVAC system. And then there's a dispute about, well, how much should have been paid? And the owner says, I'm not going to pay you. And so the HVAC company then goes and places what's called a mechanics lien saying, I'm owed money on the property. And then when it comes time to sell the property, we can't conduct the sale until that vendor basically releases that mechanic lien. it's particularly tricky because a lot of the times the owner is outraged, they charged me too much, whatever, and don't want to pay. And you can often negotiate with these vendors, especially if that lien's been sitting around a while. They'll be glad to get any money out of it, but that negotiation can take time. And if they find out that there's an active contract and there's a time clock ticking, then those vendors sometimes will play hardball and say, well, we want to be paid in full. So there's many reasons why it can kind of be tricky. And then sometimes it's hard hunting down the right person with that company to actually sign off on the release of Mechanics Liens. So there's quite a few little issues that can make it tricky.
Might be a good idea to get that taken care of before you even list the property for sale.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Lisa.
For the strongest negotiating position. That's what I'll say.
Exactly.
So there's one more that I want to talk about, and that's the IRS liens. Those often take longer to resolve other than title issues. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. Well, anyone who's ever tried to communicate with the IRS already knows where this conversation is going. The IRS is very slow to respond. And even prior to the radical cuts in IRS staffing, it was a very long process. And now it's much longer to get a response. Often in this case, too, the owner of the property that's selling wants to be able to negotiate, and you can negotiate with the IRS, but that process can take months. And I'm seriously saying, like, we had one that took almost 6 months for the negotiation to conclude. So it's always a good idea to try and get those taken care of ahead of time prior to the sale of the house.
And Douglas, what kinds of title problems can come up when property ownership hasn't been properly transferred after someone's death?
This is something that we see very frequently on the east side of town, where a lot of the developers are building condo regimes right now. They're buying properties from families where that house has been in the family for 50, 60, 70 years. And, the way it happens is grandma dies and she leaves it to one of the daughters, and the daughter dies and leaves it to one of her children. And everyone sort of assumes, well, this is my house. I've been living in it. I've been paying taxes on it. I've been taking care of it. But unfortunately, because there was no will, it was never probated, that granddaughter is actually in title with all the other heirs of the grandmother, and those folks have to get involved in the process and authorize the sale of the house, and even have to agree how those proceeds are going to be split up, because as the other granddaughters or grandsons, they could say, well, actually, I want some of that, even though that one granddaughter has been paying for the house to be taken care of this whole time.
That sounds tricky and
It
time
is.
consuming.
It is tricky and time consuming. Now, there is a way for us to be able to do the transfer. We do something called an heirship affidavit. And that basically says, here's all the heirs, here's who are the people involved. And we then have one of the heirs sign it, and then two disinterested witnesses who say, yes, these are all of the heirs, and they're on an affidavit stating that these are the correct family members that need to get paid off. It is important to have disinterested witnesses. Obviously, if you're all going to get money as family members, you have an interest in making it happen and maybe crowding out a brother you don't like. So we always need two disinterested witnesses to sign the heirship affidavit, as well as one family member. And then, of course, once that's done and we have the full list of heirs, then all of those heirs have to come to the closing or have to have a mobile notary in order to sign off on the sale of the property. And it can be very complicated. We've had some transactions where there was as many as 32 heirs that had to be involved. Yeah. And that's if you can hunt them all down. We found there's heirs that are in prison, things that you have to do that take a little bit longer to get a signature than to just send a mobile notary to somebody.
And Douglas, we've talked about a lot of different issues that can come up with these, with transferring clear title. When do these show up? How do you discover them? Is this something that only happens as you're going into the closing? Many of these things should be able to be resolved ahead of time. Where do people go to find out more information about this?
Well, you're absolutely right, Lisa. The worst time to discover these things is 2 days before closing. Typically, however, they're discovered when we open title and we start doing the research, which is anywhere from 30 to 60 days in advance of a residential closing and can be up to 6 months to a year on commercial closings, depending upon their complexity. Now, the if it's a 30-day close and you have 32 errors to track down, you're not going to close on time. So one of the things that we do is we try and encourage listing agents to open up title with us even in advance of any contract being signed, so that we can take a look at the title commitment, take a look at the research, and see if there's going to be some big red flags. Buyers are a lot more patient when they're told before signing the contract, hey, this is going to need a 60-day close, than they are after signing the contract and then they get informed of it. So we always say it's best practice to try and open title with Midtown Title well in advance, the minute you get the listing, so we can just double check.
I have to say that's brilliant. I have not come across many companies that are thinking outside the box. It's very
Yes.
non-traditional to start early, but what a
Yes.
brilliant idea to keep the
Yeah.
transaction moving
Yeah.
and probably reduce costs.
Yeah, it keeps people from being disappointed about a change in time frame from what they were expecting.
Sure. And then the seller might have to extend how long they're making mortgage payments. The costs go up to get to closing.
That's right.
So much value.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's talk about real life examples. Can you share a real life example of a title issue that looks straightforward at first, but turned out to be much more complicated to resolve?
Well, on one of them, we had a builder who had a mechanics lien on the property he was trying to sell, and he provided us with a release of lien from the mechanics lien, and we were getting ready to go close, and then the vendor company popped up out of the mist and said that was a fraudulently signed release of the mechanics lien. We never signed it. The person who signed it was not authorized by us, and that mechanics lien is still valid. And then we had to go through a negotiation period, and it was a big hassle, to say the least. Um, we've had situations where somebody was using a power of attorney on behalf of a grandmother who was incapacitated and was in a nursing home, or needed to be in a nursing home. And the granddaughter was trying to sell the house to get the funds to put her in a memory care unit. And on the day of closing, some of the other granddaughters got together and convinced the grandmother to revoke the power of attorney. And all of a sudden, we're in limbo because this granddaughter has no authority to sign on behalf of the grandmother now that the power of attorney has been revoked. So there's lots of last minute hitches that can cause a little bit of anxiety and a lot of stress for the title company that's trying to conduct the closings. And that's just a couple of examples. The list it can go on quite extensively.
If you know anybody who has had a housing transaction as a buyer or a seller, they've probably run into something or they've heard a horror story about it. It's so
Yes,
true. It
absolutely.
happens every day. Is there anything that buyers, sellers, agents, or property owners can do to identify title problems before they become last minute issues?
Well, like I mentioned before, I think it's important to uh, make sure that we open the listing early, obviously, but then more specifically for the individuals themselves, for either the sellers or the listing agents, making sure that they inform us of any marital status changes in advance. That would seem to be an obvious thing, but we had one where we walked into a closing and the seller had to sign a marital status affidavit in front of us. She had indicated that she was single on her entry form. And then when it came to signing the affidavit, she mentioned, oh, well, actually, I'm separated. And we suddenly had to go track down her husband, who was a truck driver driving across the country, to sign off on the sale. So obviously, if there is something involving a divorce or you've been divorced during the time period of owning the property, we really need to know that, because we have to do some research to make sure that you were granted the property during the divorce. Additionally, and this seems pretty obvious, but it's surprising how often this has happened, travel plans. Do you have any travel plans for either the week before or the week after closing? If so, please let us know. Often we'll be 2 days from closing and we'll say, okay, can the seller come in 2 days? And they're like, oh, the seller's on vacation in Japan right now. and that can really wreck a closing. Obviously, as I mentioned before, from that one example with the grandmother, any seller incapacity issues, boy, we'd like to know that ahead of time. It's, one thing to sort of say, oh yeah, grandma will be there. And it's another to say, oh, grandma doesn't know what she's doing. And I just tell her where to sign. And of course, that stops everything. We can't have anyone signing that isn't capable. And in those cases, one of the children needs to be named an adult guardian, or hopefully there was a power of attorney signed well in advance of her incapacity that allowed the adult to sign on their behalf. If there is a power of attorney, we do have to ratify that, which means we actually have to talk to the person. So say a husband's traveling, gives a power of authority to his wife, both of them need to sign off on the sale. We need to be able to reach the husband on that day and say, hey, does the wife still have the power of attorney? Have you revoked it in the last 24 hours? And of course, they always say no, but we have to be able to get a hold of them. We can't have anyone say, oh, he's unreachable for the day. It's like we have to be able to get in touch with him. On the buyer side, it's a lot more simple things that you'd be surprised are kind of gotchas. Checking the names on your loan application to see if that matches how you want to be in title. So if you want to be William T. Smith and your loan app has you signed up as Bill Smith, then we're going to have a problem because the loan documents won't match the title documents. So always checking with your lender to make sure that the loan application and all the documents they're preparing are how you want to be in title. Same thing for buyers, of course. Are you having any travel plans coming up the week before or the week after closing? Please let us know so we can start doing some Plan B planning. And then the other thing that's a really good practice for buyers, and I encourage them to do it, and they rarely do it, is to ask the lender for documents 48 hours in advance. Most lenders prepare documents and they get delivered anywhere from 1 day to 20 minutes before the closing. And if there's an issue with those documents, then it messes up your closing, such as name issues, name misspellings, things like that. But additionally, if this lender sends you their documents in advance, that means they finalized everything. And that means we have all of the lender fees, which means we can give you an accurate amount that you need to wire your funds for closing. And it's very important that, we have an accurate number to give to you so we know what you can wire to us.
Very good. Those are all excellent tips. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for walking through all these title challenges and making it sound complicated but doable. We appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. It was good talking with you, Lisa. I appreciate it.
And folks, thank you for joining us on Clear to Close, Austin Real Estate Law and Title with Douglas Plummer of Midtown Title. If you'd like to learn more about Midtown Title or real estate transactions in the Austin area, visit midtowntitle.com. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and please share this episode with someone who might need it. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.